Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and today we continue our coverage of the outcome and impact of the Alaska summit. And indeed, the news is still rolling. We're still learning more about what was said, what was demanded, and what the follow-up may be. It seems today that European leaders, together with Zelensky, are going to talk to Trump, and of course Zelensky is going to head to the White House next week. We now learn that he's going to be accompanied by European allies, which is a great relief. It makes it less likely that he'll be cornered, bullied and humiliated in the Oval Office, such as what happened last time. Before we jump into this episode, thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Your support and generosity is incredibly well received, especially all those who help with the fundraiser for the 69th Sniffing Brigade. The details of that are in the description of the video. And of course, everyone who helps with Patreon and buy me a coffee. I can't emphasize how your support is greatly appreciated, but it's also essential to help me continue making these videos day in, day out. Now let's jump in. Summits and surrender. America's morality left on the tarmac. Again, as true gluttons for punishment, addicts for the truth, no matter how searing and how painful, we're diving into the awkward red carpet tango of tyrants that was the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. No ceasefire, no firm agreement, just optics, photo ops, and America's moral compass burying its needle in the direction of irretrievably lost. Just imagine the thoughts going through the minds of Western politicians and diplomats. Month after month of effort invested to help explain to Trump the importance of peace through strength, the vitality of not conceding to Putin, the imperative not to betray Ukraine, even the tortuous hours spent trying to penetrate his orange skull with the idea that Ukraine is the victim, not the perpetrator, and that they did not seek war and did not start the war. And one 3-hour session with the killer from the Kremlin, and it all goes out of the window, figuratively, not literally, unfortunately. And now they must start again from the very basics to teach the orange conman why surrendering to a genocidal dictator might not be the right thing to do, and might not actually serve the interests of America and global democracy. The summit and all that glitters golden is not necessarily glamorous. Anchorage, Alaska, August 15th, 2025. The unforgiving tundra melted for Putin, the tyrant. The blood-red carpet was rolled out. America's soldiers were forced to genuflect in front of the plane that brought Putin to his triumph as they rolled that carpet out. Kremlin Force One, or the killer transport from Moscow. There is an F-22 flying over, a backdrop banner reading "Pursuing Peace," when it all smelled a little bit of Hollywood or of disgrace and decadence, the kind of twisted version you might find in Stranger Things or The Twilight Zone. But as Time's Bobby Gosh put it, Trump had little to show for his theatrical diplomacy except the bitter taste of being outmaneuvered by a more cunning adversary. The New York's Susan Glasser offered blistering irony. Nothing says standing up to Russian aggression quite like welcoming the aggressor on a red carpet and applauding him. That was in The New Yorker, while of course putting absolutely no pressure on him to change his violent behaviour. Well, that was the stagecraft, but what about the outcome? Not even a ceasefire. As Glasser summed it up, we didn't get there. Cynics like me would say we were never going to get there without putting some lethally effective pressure on Putin and his genocidal minions. Well, there was none of that. The summit spectacle and the moral vacuum. Putin, wanted by the ICC for war crimes, lands not as a pariah but as a red-carpeted guest, greeted as an honoured dignitary, welcomed as a friend even. As AP summed it up, Putin walked on a red carpet as US warplanes flew overhead, a show of power shown off to a friend. That was written in AP News, and there was an air of boasting there, as one schoolboy might brag about his Christmas haul of presents to a friend. Look what I've got, and look what it can do. A former British ambassador put it bluntly, the summit produced nothing for Mr. Trump and gave Mr. Putin most of what he was looking for. Again, that was reported in AP News. Trump's flip. Has he adopted the Russian agenda? Well, pre-summit, Trump had insisted on a ceasefire. Post-summit, he dropped that demand. The Washington Post reports that within hours of the meeting, Trump had discarded his previous position that a full ceasefire was required. Instead, he pivoted to pushing for a comprehensive peace deal without first stopping the bleeding, without first freezing the violence and intimidation. By Saturday morning, Trump was pushing for a sweeping peace agreement, not a pause in the bloodshed. He wrote, "The best way to end the horrific war is to go directly to a peace agreement and not a mere ceasefire agreement," reported in Coco. This, of course, is a nonsense position and is not a path to peace at all. Merely it's a rhetorical trick to try and push the blame for the war onto the victim, not the aggressor. But it's worse, far worse perhaps than most realise. Putin's agenda was not peace, but to get permission to continue the violence without consequences. Russia continues to load up a full agreement with absurd rhetoric and demands: surrender of territory, demilitarization, denazification, the dismissal of Ukraine's entire elected government, submission to Russia's sphere of influence, and Russia's linguistic, cultural and political dominance. It's an agenda of evil. It's an imperial agenda, a genocidal agenda, one of surrender and obsequiousness. And Trump has swallowed this crap hook, line and sinker. Putin wanted three things. He wanted to get the threat of more punitive sanctions lifted and achieved that. He wanted the endless shifting deadlines for devastating punitive action threatened by Trump to be lifted entirely, and that happened. He wanted to shift the perception of the barriers and blockers to peace. He wanted to shift that from the aggressor to the victim. And for the moment, Putin seems to have achieved all three of these. On the plane returning from the summit, Trump, at Putin's behest, told Zelensky that Russia wanted to freeze the front lines only if Ukraine ceded all of Donbass at the very minimum. And Trump advised, "You got to make a deal," reported by Reuters. This, of course, is a bullshit position. Submission, capitulation and appeasement rolled into one. Notice the sleight of hand as well. He abandoned the ceasefire so Putin could keep fighting and disguise this with the illusion of peacemaking. But Putin is a deathmonger, not a peacemonger, and Trump is now entirely complicit in that strategy. The moral shift couldn't be clearer. Trump just went from being a weak and vacillating but nominally neutral arbiter to echoing the Kremlin's script. No ceasefire, no resistance to territorial demands. Has he adopted the Russian agenda? Well, yes, fully and completely. For now, of course, while he is surrounded by the halo of Putin's words, basking in the warm glow of the dictator's praise and influence, flattery and manipulation. He has adopted that position. Perhaps tomorrow it will change again. Trump was outplayed in Alaska and received no ceasefire and no concessions. The picture is damning. Damning because Putin gave nothing away. Putin emerged having achieved precisely what he came for: legitimacy on American soil, eroding Western unity, presenting his territorial demands as reasonable. So says Time magazine. Half-baked in Alaska was what many of the newspaper headlines led with. Trump arrived without preparation and without a plan. It was a diplomatic failure on an historical scale. Future diplomats will study this episode as a lesson of how not to project strength, how not to stand up for democracy and values, and how not to achieve a result against an adversary that is ruthless and focused, determined and cunning. Trump gave Putin global legitimacy with zero costs, says the Australian. And the reactions of many in Europe and the US, and especially Ukraine, have echoed that sentiment. In Russia, there's also been a considerable amount of relief and boasting. After many initial reservations about the wisdom of the summit and a recognition that Russia was entering with a very weak hand, the Russian state media and even the Z patriot community has embraced the perception of Putin's success. Russia celebrates a diplomatic win while their advances on the battlefields are rapidly being reversed. One Kremlin figure put it this way: the summit was like breaking out of international isolation. To my mind, it's more something like a virulent disease breaking out of quarantine. The Washington Post quotes Andrei Klishas: a new European and international security architecture is on the agenda and everyone must accept it. Well, actually, they don't have to, but that doesn't stop the genocide-loving scum in the Kremlin from boasting. Dmitry Medvedev crowed that negotiations now happen without preconditions, with continuation of the special military operation, as reported in the Washington Post. Times Gauche called it theatrical diplomacy that delivered nothing. The New Yorker labelled it a self-owned summit. The Guardian warned that putting Trump alone with Putin in a room is a recipe for disaster, and so it proved, even though he apparently had some chaperones. CBS News reported European leaders reaffirming solidarity with Ukraine and pushing for a trilateral summit with Trump, Putin and Zelensky. That's according to CBS News. That's very unlikely to happen because nothing would compel Putin to sit in a room face to face with Zelensky in a situation where he may have to give concessions. Meanwhile, defense ministers reminded us there can be no negotiation about Ukraine without Ukraine. Trump does not seem to realize that. In Ukraine, the media was defiant, but with a defensive tone, rejecting territorial surrender. Of course, Reuters records Zelensky rejecting the abandonment of Donetsk and preparing to meet Trump with European support, fortunately. Russia, of course, was delighted. Europe was cautious. Ukraine was alarmed. The liberal US media, however, was incensed at the loss of moral courage and political clout that Trump's behaviour has caused. No deal, no consequences. Why Putin is getting away with murder. Well, here's the sobering part. Without an agreement, without any penalties, what we may get instead is a fully emboldened Putin. As the Washington Post framed it, Russia sees victory as Trump adopts Putin's approach, which enables Russia to keep fighting without the risk of US sanctions. That's in the Washington Post, and of course it echoes one of those three priorities that we listed earlier. And of course we could add a fourth to that, which is Putin's desire to drive a wedge between the US and allies. It's not evident yet whether that has succeeded. Well, Putin walked away with time, breathing room, a rebooted standing with America. The New Yorker called it grotesque. Putin got one hell of a photo op and still more time on the clock to prosecute his war. Meanwhile, America's most effective tool, which is Western unity and sanctions, just flickered, threatening to be extinguished. An AP security expert put it in crystal clear terms. Putin came with the goal of stalling pressure on Russia to end the war. He will consider the summit outcome as a mission accomplished. And now there are pressures on Kyiv, even to accept a bad deal. Ukrainian resistance is strong, but the message from the West is getting muddied. Get a deal or risk abandonment. Europe may unify, but public statements are not enough to counteract this perception of pressure on Kiev. The moral question, do we shame Ukraine into surrendering for our convenience? Because we're tired, even though Ukraine is doing all the fighting and the dying? Well, that's not solidarity. That's cynicism of the lowest possible form. It is weakness incarnate. Trump failed to deliver, weak and sucked into the glamour of a summit. Trump's weakness isn't just a negotiation flaw, it's a pattern. Time called it seduced by summits, but Trump, failed to deliver again in Alaska. Trump mistakes the cameras for accomplishment. Reagan walked away from Reykjavik rather than accept a bad deal. Trump walks into Alaska, emerges with empty hands, and is all smiles for the cameras. This isn't strength, it's vanity masquerading as diplomacy, and it is supremely dangerous. The moral collapse of American power. When America rolls out the welcome mat for a murderer, that is already a kind of moral collapse. The New York Glasser described it thus: the grotesque juxtaposition, red carpet greeting for a butcher. Western authority depends on moral clarity. When that's absent, we surrender not just land but integrity, moral authority, soft power, and eventually hard power as well. There was no deal from the summit and no appearance of moral backbone. A war criminal was normalized and America emerged much diminished. Former intelligence chiefs didn't mince their words. John Brennan said that Trump's behavior looked like treason. James Clapper wondered if Putin had compromat on him. Alaska was more than a meeting in front of the cameras. It was a full betrayal of values, the moment that historians may point to as the final erosion of American power and authority. A summit where America's moral standing took a sucker punch to the face. Putin won, Ukraine bleeds, Europe watches, and Trump grins. But history doesn't forgive moral neglect, especially if it leads to real-world consequences. If Ukraine falls, which I think at this point is unlikely, it will be on Trump's shoulders, happening on his watch. Another consequence is that Putin continues to fight and erodes the Russian economy, bleeds out Russia's resources until that country collapses. Again, this will be on Trump's shoulders for his diplomatic and political failings. This may, in fact, be the eventual irony. Trump is acting to make Russia great again while weakening the US. But the evil empire of his friend Vladimir Putin, the evil empire of the Kremlin, may soon implode because of its addiction to war, aggression, and violence.